Hi, we're going to get started. Ugh. Hi, we're going to get started. Thanks very much for coming out this afternoon for the first of what promises to be a robust and fascinating week-long discussion on the future of news. My name is Justin Peters. I work at a magazine called the Columbia Journalism Review in New York City. We recently celebrated our 50th anniversary, and as part of this celebration, we've been thinking very hard about how journalism may evolve over the next 50 years. I feel like journalism and digital journalism is still in the very early stages of this evolutionary process, and I believe we're still at the point where we can build a new journalism suited to its medium and its era. We can reconceive the news in a way that retains the virtues of the existing model while embracing all of the values of the digital medium. The four panels I'm leading this week will talk about how to get from here to there. And this afternoon we'll be talking about the ways in which news outlets can and should make the most of the digital communities that arise around their work. A lot of news, well, pretty much all news organizations these days say that they take their communities very seriously and they want to make the most of them. But in practice, I've found that most news organizations seem to be afraid or contemptuous of the communities that arise around their work. They find those communities inarticulate, hostile, hypercritical, so they avoid them or dismiss them and don't really make the most of them. But I feel that the best news organizations will find ways to participate in these communities, to mediate and moderate the discussions that come up, to encourage and listen to dissent, and ultimately to make something productive and intelligible out of the noise. And I think it's a topic that's ripe for discussion. We've got three very intelligent and capable discussants to talk about it. From my right, we have Charlie Beckett, who's the director of Polis, the media research think tank at the London School of Economics. Next to him, we have Mark Johnson, who's the community editor at The Economist. And last but not least, we have Lucy Chambers, the community coordinator for the Open Knowledge Foundation. And Charlie, I want to start with you. In the preface to a report that Polis just released in January called Is Comment Free, about the moderation of comments on news websites, you wrote, "We thought that public participation would be entertaining and informative, but above all, that it would create a conversation that would enhance the way we run our lives. In practice, any debate is as likely to end up a shouting match as it is to turn into some kind of Socratic dialogue." Why is that? What are news organizations doing wrong, and why is it so hard to get it right?
Well, actually, that statement sounds like a sort of cry of despair, and it's certainly something that you hear all the time. You hear it from journalists who, when they write beautiful articles or they write revelatory exposés, or they write insightful art reviews, and then along comes the public and writes something underneath, below the line, which is often critical, sometimes offensive, and usually quite challenging, and quite often dismissive, and very perhaps colloquial. And journalists get upset about that. But of course, readers do as well. Often readers look at the kind of comment below the article, and they also feel that doesn't, I don't want to go there, I don't want to go in that space. And so perhaps that original idea that the internet and interactivity and public participation would create a beautiful space of lovely kind of dinner party conversation or erudite seminar environment, that kind of ideal obviously isn't the case. Now, I don't despair, quite the opposite. I think that, in a sense, all that is happening is that what used to happen in the real world is now happening online. And so, you know, when I used to make TV news programs, or when people used to write on the newspaper, and the reader or the viewer would often be swearing at the television, you know, my God, what idiots these people are. They've got it wrong. They've forgotten this. I hate them. But of course, we never heard that. And indeed, they would rarely bother to write to the newspaper. They would read the newspaper and classically say, you know, to the husband or the wife, have you seen what that idiot has written in the newspaper today? He's mad. I disagree. So what all we're getting really, I think, is reality brought online. Now, I think it's then up to the journalist or the newsroom or the news organization to decide what kind of conversation they want, whether they want a conversation at all, and what their role is in it. And that's the research report that you're referring to, which was an interesting piece of work by a Swedish journalist. So, if you like, from the home of rational political debate and a media that is relatively objective and balanced culturally. And she compared online moderation there with online moderation in The Guardian, as it were, which in a sense, although The Guardian is run by extremely intelligent and lovely people who are very liberal and open-minded, its comment columns and its contributions from their readers are some of the most filthy and angry that you're going to read. And also, it has to be said, also some of the wittiest, cleverest, and most entertaining and thoughtful comments you get. The trick, of course, and that's what this panel is about moderation. How do you moderate? And what came out of our research report, really, in a way, I think is obvious, but it needs restating, which is there are no rules, unless you want to make some up. That there is no real law, apart from, you know, some countries will have laws on racist speak or hate speak, that you have to follow. That it's very much to do with the identity you have as a news organization and the value that you might get out of allowing the public to participate in that. And I think, so my despair, if you like, the despairing statement that you quoted, in a sense is the opposite. It's saying, well, what did you expect? People are angry as well as intelligent. People are very committed. The fact that they react at all shows that they somehow think that your journalism is important, even if they're disagreeing with it. So it's up to you to decide how you're going to handle that conversation. And there are lots of techniques, and I think, you know, my colleagues might come on to this. There are lots of techniques on that spectrum that you can adopt that will help to shape, if you want to shape, that conversation. But, you know, to finish here really, I think that you have to recognize there's a spectrum. Right from one end where there is no moderation at all, where, you know, comment really is free, and you see that classically in the British media, you see it with a blog called Guido Fawkes, who does very little moderation, and so the commentary tends to be very vituperative, but also very funny sometimes, and he has built tremendous loyalty from a very big following, a very big readership, because he lets people say whatever they want, up to, I think, he limits racist speak, I think. And indeed, there's a big website in Sweden where, of course, this is very controversial in the wake of the Breivik shootings, where much of the Scandinavian media actually shut down commentary because they were so disturbed at the number of people who were expressing similar sentiments to Breivik. And yet there was another website which did not moderate, and people were allowed to express that. And so you had a choice there between a news organization with quite strong values and a sense of what is permissible, and a news organization that didn't. And of course, the one that didn't got enormous traffic. and the other one's got less traffic. So I think there's all sorts of different ways you can shape the conversation. We can perhaps talk about that afterwards. But the important thing to realise is that the value, first of all, the extraordinary value that at a time when, you know, as journalists we're fighting for public attention, that to ignore it when the public want to contribute and when they want to talk to you, I think is criminal. But how you choose to have that is very much about your identity, your ethics, and your value as a journalist.
Mark Johnson, I want to jump off of something that Charlie just said when he was talking about how it's up to any given news organization to decide what sort of conversation they want, how they want to foster and moderate that sort of discussion. You've said in the past that there are three parts to your role as community editor: management, evangelism, and development. And I want to start off by asking you about the evangelism part of your job duties, which, as I understand it, means you going to the journalists and editors on staff at The Economist and convincing them that participation in the discussions that arise around their work isn't just a great optional add-on to what they've traditionally written and reported, but as vital a part of their job as anything else. How do you sell that concept to an organization that's done things one way for such a long time? And how successful do you think you've been?
Yes, thank you. So we've found pretty much that our readers' excitement in what we do online and on social media grows in direct correlation to how close they feel to our journalists. And this is especially true for us because for decades and decades we've written without bylines, and we still are anonymous online. So readers really enjoy feeling more connected to our journalists, finding out a bit more about them and feeling like they are in some kind of conversation with them. So this sort of evangelism part of my job, I've started to stop using the word evangelism because I'm told that in different languages it has all sorts of strange connotations. But basically it involves explaining to our journalists why we're doing the things that we're doing, encouraging them to take advantage of social media and community platforms, both for personal and professional reasons, and sort of looping them into events that we run. A lot of the events that we do online involve editors to moderate, to take part. And we've also found that the debates in the comment threads themselves are better, more engaging, more interesting if journalists are there. So this is quite an important part of what I do. And to be honest with you, I don't know how insightful I can be because I am basically extremely lucky. I'm lucky that we have an extraordinary group of journalists who spend all day, every day, learning about new things in their particular scope, in their particular areas of interest on their beat. And they have taken with great enthusiasm to this world. They are very excited by the opportunities that it presents. And I haven't need to do much arm twisting, very fortunately. They're also quite a small team. I think many people are surprised by how few journalists The Economist actually has, certainly compared to some of the massive dailies. So it's easy for me to get around and to meet people and to talk to people, which is a lot of what the job involves. And another reason we're lucky is that we have an extraordinary group of readers. We really do have a very distinguished audience, very experienced people. We're very lucky, and I hope we continue to deserve that audience, and we wouldn't swap them with any other news organisation in the world. And they leave generally very good comments. I think every news website on the world is going to have a mix of very good stuff and fairly bad stuff. But I think our journalists can look at our site and they can see that our best stuff is better than anything out there, and our bad stuff is certainly no worse than anybody else's. And that has helped, I think, with the battle, if there ever was a battle, of persuading why this matters around the newsroom. And another thing I think it's important to say is that we don't really see community in terms of debate, in terms of sort of reasoned argument, as actually being anything that is new to The Economist at all, despite the fact that we've been running for 160 years. We have this mission statement that was published in the very first issue of The Economist in 1843, I think, that reads that The Economist was first founded to take part in a severe contest between intelligence, which presses forward, and an unworthy, timid ignorance which obstructs our progress. So that might sound old-fashioned, but that appears every single week on the contents page of our magazine. And although I don't suppose that our founder, James Wilson, when he first wrote those words, right at the beginning of this mass media age from which we're only now just emerging, I don't suppose he would ever have imagined that I would interpret his words in the way that I do today. But it's very clear to me, and indeed to the rest of the team that I work with, to our journalists, that the most severe contests these days are not just happening in newsprint, in magazines, but they're also taking part in the community forums, in the message boards, in the websites all around the web. And that if The Economist is actually to continue the mission that it has fought so hard for over the last century or so, it's those kinds of severe contests that it needs to be taking part in, and indeed that it needs to be convening. So that sort of collection of good luck means that I do much less of this evangelism than I ever had to do before, and more I'm finding journalists are walking into my office and saying, I've had this great idea, I've heard there's this great website, how can you help me do this? And that's been a very exciting thing to witness over the last few years.
I'm sure I'm paraphrasing this badly, the frenzied contest between intelligence and...
Severe contest.
The severe contest between intelligence and ignorance is something that the Open Knowledge Foundation and Lucy Chambers also do quite a bit with. And I think it probably could be said that the entire goal of the Open Knowledge Foundation is to come down on the side of intelligence in that severe contest by trying to harness the power of the sort of disparate communities out there to build something intelligent and true. Could you talk a little bit about what the Open Knowledge Foundation is, what you do there, and how you go about recruiting and managing the communities that you use?
I certainly can, listen. I actually have some slides, because I think if I don't show you some slides, you'll think that we're a load of weirdos who just kind of hang out in dark rooms. So I was just wondering if I could have my slides. Yes, okay. So thank you very much, Justin. My name is Lucy Chambers, and I am a community coordinator at the Open Knowledge Foundation. I end up describing my role in a variety of ways, ranging from, and I apologize to the translators before I say this, but ranging from cat herding to kind of being a bridge, a technical, between the technical team. We do a lot of building tools and also kind of building the communities that we're going to use the tools. So my role is essentially to be a catalyst. I'm proud to say that I don't have to be an expert in anything at the Open Knowledge Foundation. I benefit an awful lot from the wisdom of the communities that I facilitate. We have an enormous kind of a volunteer following participation. There are only about 30 people that actually work for the Open Knowledge Foundation, but there are several thousand people who are involved with our projects. So just very briefly, just to show you what we do, we exist to promote open access to data and open access to information. We try and do this mainly by building things rather than telling people they should just be doing it. So we try and build things and show them how they can be used and why people should care about it. And this is just a quick overview of what we mean by openness. It's just the freedom to use and reuse and redistribute the things that we build. So that's both information and the tools we build, open source tools. And this is really kind of key, I think, to the type of interaction that we end up having with the volunteers that we end up integrating with. In a couple of the examples that I'm going to show you just in a second, the fact that we do open stuff open stuff. That's a horrible way to put it, but we are attempting to build these resources which anybody can benefit from, and that makes them incredibly powerful. It means that the speed with which we're able to find the hotspots that people are interested in, the speed with which we're able to put together enormous resources is kind of really, really, really important. But it also means that people really care about putting something into this kind of information source, because they get something back out of it as well. So there are three areas that we work in. The first is open government, and it's the kind of the biggest area that we work in. We work on both sides. We work both attempting to kind of promote the transparency side of things by getting governments to open up the data, but we also work with the governments themselves in attempting to allow them to foster debate. So this isn't just about journalism, this has also become quite a fashionable topic within governments itself, like how can we use the power of the people to show us where we're getting stuff wrong. And it's really, really exciting. Lots of people are starting thinking about this in kind of budgetary senses, like how can we get people to show us where we should be spending the money, and everything. The second area is open research. So again, for journalists, this is quite an interesting area, because this is pulling out a lot of the kind of the open data behind the research that you probably didn't ever see before. So people published something and you had to take it for granted about whether it was true or not. But also there are lots of tools that scientists use which to kind of crowdsource information in that way, which could be relevant for journalists as well. And the last one is kind of open cultural heritage, which is promoting knowledge of the public domain, and when copyright expires, showing people what you can do with that type of thing. So that's just what we do. And projects, tools, and communities is the three main areas that we work in. So I think I've forgotten exactly what the question was, but I think it was basically how we do what we do.
Well, let's focus that a bit. Take that overview you just gave us and sort of explain it in the context of open spending, which I think is a quite fascinating project, and the sort of thing that news organizations in the future, may well follow as a model of trying to accumulate knowledge that not necessarily is just of a breaking news variety, but building sort of databases and resources that in their way also say something valuable and relevant about things going on in the public sphere.
Yes. So the main project that I work on is called Open Spending, and it has the slightly ambitious aim of attempting to get hold of all of the government financial information in the world and put it into a big database so that people can search it, particularly journalists can search it. It's going quite well, but what we did with what we were aiming at with Open Spending was a bit similar to what the fantastic guys at OpenStreetMap have done with mapping data. So this is an example. It's one of my favorite examples of why what we do is kind of important. So this is what Sarajevo in Bosnia looks like if you go to the mighty Google Maps, and this is what it looks like if you go to OpenStreetMap, which is a collaborative effort on the kind of anybody can contribute to it, and anybody can also benefit from it and reuse it in any way that they like. And what we're aiming for with Open Spending is the ability to do exactly the same type of thing. People come to us with a spending data set and they can load it into Open Spending, and they can produce these beautiful kind of bubble visualizations of what their local council does or what their national government does, and it gives them an incentive to put something into it. But also on the other side, there's an incentive, there's a kind of a byproduct of that, which is this fantastic database, which other people can hopefully benefit from as well. And we had our first spending story come out of this database at the end, pretty recently, which was an organisation called Privacy International, which some of you no doubt have heard of, came to us and they said, we have lots of data from about companies which provide surveillance information to provide new surveillance information to and services to governments. We want to be able to search across all of your data sets in open spending and basically encourage people to use what you have to do information, freedom of information requests, because once we've searched in open spending, we can actually show that these people have contracts with government, and that's really important.
Charlie, I want to go off something that Lucy said that I found quite interesting about using the power of the people to show us where we're getting stuff wrong. And I think that dovetails quite nicely with something you said in your opening remarks about how people who comment on news websites are angry as well as intelligent. And the anger so often manifests itself in derisive remarks or things that are belittling or not necessarily productive. And all too often, that's where it ends. That's where it begins and ends. How do we get from anger to intelligence? How do we harness the one and build it into the other?
Well, I think one other interesting aspect that Lucy sort of raises is the fact that, in the first place, we were talking, or I was talking about the moderation of news websites. And can I just ask people, how many people here have ever commented on a news website? How many people here have commented in reaction to reading something, but on something like Facebook or Twitter or that kind of network? Right, you see. Now that is the big story, which is that the conversation is now happening in places that the journalists can't directly moderate. So, in a sense, yes, it's true that, when Mark's looking at the comments beneath an article, that's important, and how you have a conversation there is important. But actually, gosh, those funny old people, those real people, are having their own conversations about what journalism does without the permission of the journalist. And so there's a wider challenge there for the journalist. Are they going to go, for example, onto Facebook, onto Twitter, to join in those conversations? And of course, if they do that, they are then subject to the rules, or the lack of rules, of those spaces. So I think it's actually, if as a journalist you are trying to, you have to think about your motive, don't you? In a sense, primarily the journalist is usually thinking, can I get people to pay attention to me and to my work, and ideally to give me some money, either through advertising or subscription. But of course, if you're having a conversation on Twitter or Facebook, then the last thing you want is a journalist coming into your room with their elbows out and shouting about listening to them and doing what they say. So I think the first lesson to trying to get people to pay attention to you is to think, why are they talking about my journalism? Is it because it's relevant? Is it because it's interesting? What are they saying? And at that point, I think you get into a really interesting value for the journalist, which is you can learn so much, not from the traffic, it's not just the twits or the Facebook likes, it's not the numbers alone, although that is important because, we are in the business of attention. But it's thinking about, well, how are people responding? So, that may give you valuable information. If people are reacting in a particular way, for example, about a politician or an event, then that might give you information about, wider perspectives that people have. And it may give you concrete things. It may give you facts, it might give you information, it might give you access to material as well. And so I think that when we talk about a conversation, it's not just a chat, it's not just about opinion, it's actually about how the public can be part of an extended journalism process. And that, I think, is why it's so important what Lucy's talking about, that that people are starting to have tools and platforms of their own where they're having those conversations. And at the same time, you've got fantastic organizations like The Economist who are also building platforms and spaces where people can have conversation. I think the intersection between that is going to be really interesting.
So I want to pose you a two-part question based on what Charlie just said, Mark. First of all, about the conversations that take place on The Economist's website. You'd said that people tend to leave very good comments and are intelligent participants in the discussions that you foster through the Oxford-style debates that you run and other such things. But it's not a given that if you have intelligent readers, you will thus necessarily have intelligent comments. In fact, I'd say that's quite rare. I'm curious what sort of systemically The Economist does to try to encourage and foster this sort of intelligent discussion on its website. And secondly, off of what Charlie was saying about how the conversation is migrating to third-party sources, how does The Economist use Facebook and Twitter and still sort of maintain the same high standards of intelligence and participation that it tries to foster on its own website?
Hello. Two big questions there then. What do we do to ensure intelligent debate on our website? Where do I start? There are some simple things that I could say, things that we've noticed that have made a big difference. And one which you'll hear from lots of people and which I'll tell you as well is that encouraging journalists to take part in the conversations, there is a sort of teacher in the room effect. We made some upgrades recently so that every time an Economist journalist participated, there'd be a little red Economist E so that you could see who they were. And although you can't pull out a figure that says our conversations are 80% better, you definitely see that those conversations are more interesting, more engaged. People just like to know that they're being listened to. And the truth is, all our journalists do pore over the comment sections. When they write an article, they want to know what people think about it. They do read them, and our readers ought to know that we are reading them. And I think when they do, we get better conversations as a result. We've also tried to encourage more conversation between readers on the basis that that also helps to improve a lot of the debate, that people can have their questions answered, people can have corrections sort of noted. So we've done things like upgrade our own commenting tools just so that readers can reply to each other. That might sound like a very basic feature, but actually that's made a massive difference to how the sections work. And I think the main thing that we've been trying to do over the last 6 months is actually just create a more open platform at economist.com for debates, on the understanding that by creating a more open platform and therefore getting a more vibrant community, we can both increase the amount of content, the amount of sort of people taking part, and increase the quality of the debate. It's sort of received wisdom to suggest that small communities, niche communities, are necessarily better than bigger ones. And in fact, my experience is that small communities are often led by a small crowd of very loud voices who feel very much at home and lead debates in any way they want to and have the same arguments over and over again. And actually that an important way to have a healthy community is to have a great vibrancy, a great variety of people there. And having any kind of barriers to prevent people from taking part, far from keeping the riffraff out of your website. If anything, all of that does is lock the riffraff in. So we've been doing two things to become more open, and the first thing that we've been doing is making some actual technical upgrades to our site. This might all sound really obvious to you, but we've been doing things like drastically shortening the registration process. We've moved the registration around so that you can comment first and register later. Things that used to block new participants, like picking a unique username, we now just assign you a random username and let you change it later if that kind of thing bothers to you. We've added social logins so that people can take part quicker and easier. And as I say, this might all sound really obvious, and it might sound technical and not the sort of thing that journalists should worry about, but just making these changes in a couple of months increased the number of people who were taking, well, the number of comments on our website up by about 80% year on year. And more importantly, from my perspective, the number of people taking part has doubled year on year. And that's a much more vibrant place, a place where there are much more different perspectives there, and I think better debate as a result. And the other thing that we've been doing, and this sort of answers your second question as well, is that an important part of becoming more open and therefore more vibrant is the work that we've been doing to reach out onto social media sites. This hasn't provoked such drastic changes. It's been more of a slow burner. We are now active on 7 social networks. Let me see: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Tumblr, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. Yes, I think that's the 7. After years of hard work, we've been extremely successful. So we have about 1 million followers on Facebook and about 2 million on Twitter. People love to tell you how many followers they have on social networks because it's the one number that never ever goes down. So a more interesting thing for us is to talk about the amount of traffic that sends to our website as one of the metrics. And about 10% of the visits to The Economist site are now generated by these social media sources. And what that means is that we're now reaching, I mean, there are a lot of Economist users who simply find social media an interesting way to receive updates about what we're doing. But far more importantly and far more rewarding from my perspective is the way that social media has allowed us to reach people who might have had a vague understanding of what we do, but who really had not really read our magazine or knew much about us. Perhaps they thought that we were mostly about economics, when indeed we're about a whole range of subjects. And it's been incredibly exciting and rewarding to reach out to those communities, the people that hang out on Tumblr, the people that hang out on Pinterest, and indeed the people that hang out on Facebook, and to say, hey, here's who we are, here's what we really stand for. I think you'll find this very interesting. And that means that we've not only created exciting conversations and I think high-level debates on those platforms just by putting out good content and putting out interesting and important questions. We've also been able to flow back to The Economist's own website a great variety of new perspectives of new people who are bringing a new vibrancy to the kind of conversations that we're having. So I think what we've managed to do is simultaneously increase the amount of participation and generally increase the quality as well. And that's been really exciting to see take place over the last year or so.
There's a lot that I want to say about what you just said, but one quick follow-up. I know that when you first started at The Economist, one of the first things you did is you de-automated most of The Economist's social media feeds, and you put actual humans in charge of curating those and producing that material. Why is that important? And how have you found that to be sort of a valuable thing to do?
Yeah, so we have a bit of a mixed strategy on our sort of social networks, at least in terms of the sort of publishing program, I guess. The first thing is that we've had actually, against the received wisdom, great success in having a sort of economist.com Twitter feed and an Economist Facebook feed that to a great extent is about saying, here's what we wrote, here's this great article, here's what we've done today. You know, we put out about 20 links a day on Facebook and on Twitter. And that seems to be largely what people want. I think when people sign up to a news organization's feed, they are a bit surprised if you don't then feed them links to the things that you're doing. And actually, once you get, I mean, this is the world's greatest first world problem, but once you get hundreds of thousands of followers on one social media channel, the things that you can do with it become ever more limited because we started trying to use our Economist Twitter feed, which has nearly 2 million in total. We tried to use it to do more exciting things like they tell you should, to do debates and Q&As and all sorts of things. And actually we got complaints. People said, this is not why I'm following you. I don't want The Economist to send me a link to this article here. I want to read The Economist stuff. So that has worked really well, but also we've tried to grow a lot more social media channels. So we run about 15 Twitter sites. There is the central brand account if that's what you want, but we also encourage journalists in each of the departments to run specific Twitter feeds. So we have Econ China about China, Econ Europe about Europe, Econ BizFin about business and finance. And because those are smaller, more niche followings, we can do more interesting things with them. So those are the places where we do web chats. Those are the places where we link out to other news organizations. And those are the places where you see more of our editorial voice coming through. And I think that has allowed us to have sort of the best of both worlds, a sort of publishing program with Economist brand account, but also more exciting, more engaging, more human stuff going on these smaller accounts for people who really want to drill down and find out everything there is to know or everything we think about what's happening in Europe this week.
Lucy, off of what Mark said a little bit earlier about how people like to know they're being listened to and, you know, about fostering a conversation between readers. How do you and the Open Knowledge Foundation foster connections and collaborations between your users, and what can news organizations, in your opinion, learn from how you do that?
Yeah, I think a couple of the problems that news organizations have with kind of huge torrents of comments and like how do you actually turn that into a productive debate is something which can resonate quite strongly with the way that we work. We work largely via mailing lists and people having debates and discussions on mailing lists. And I think the point that Mark raised about connecting the people, you don't necessarily have to actually promote the actually often be that active a facilitator. You just have to make sure that the people have the connections that they need to each other. And I mean that's something that's relevant to governments, and it's something that's relevant to journalism as well. I'd have an example in my head of it's not one of our projects at all, but it's a blog in Croatia. It's called Politika. And as far as I know from talking to the person that runs it, it's a site to which anybody has the right to contribute, and it's one of the most widely read blogs in Croatia, as far as I know, and largely political in topic. But anybody has the right to promote. Anybody has the right to publish to it, and anybody has the right to comment on it. And the way that it works, I believe, is that they have a very established readership, very much like we have the established members of the community who have done stuff actively, who particularly on the web, I find there's this bizarre reputation. This bizarre way that reputations work. Your voice sounds a lot louder if people know who you are, and they have you see the same names coming up again and again. But the Politika works by allowing the people who have participated very actively in the blog in the past to decide which articles are posted in the first place. They go into a queue, and then they can be voted onto the blog. And then again, everybody is allowed to comment on those blog posts. And if the comments do not conform to what the readership believe is important to them, the readers can downvote them, and I believe they're never removed as an actual comment, but they have quite a quirky trick of removing all of the vowels, I think, if they disemvoweling. That's a great way to put it. So I'm sorry to the translators again, but it's a really nice thing to do to not actually have to not actually have to play that active a role as a facilitator, because you know that if you invite the right people to the conversation and you build up these kind of reputations and trusts, they'll moderate themselves. It's really fantastic.
I've always thought that that's the sign of an extremely healthy online community, where it gets to the point where it runs by itself, and where the conversation isn't necessarily on topic or necessarily pertinent to, in terms of a news organization, whatever article or whatnot might be in the article field above, but it's just people who hang out in this space and talk about what they want, and generally mimic what members of a real community do, rather than act as if they're raising their hands to answer a question in some sort of online classroom. Anyway, I want to shift for a bit, Charlie, and talk about an article you recently wrote that I found really interesting, about your experiences at the Guardian's open festival, was it, where scores of Guardian readers got together and told the newspaper that we want you to make more use of us, like we want to be more involved, we want you to ask us for money, we want to participate. And you wrote that the Guardian needs to turn its consumers from readers into a resource. How do you go about doing that? And this sort of transformational process seems to be sort of a theme of this whole panel. But how do you get from where you are to where you ultimately want to be, and where your readers want to be?
Yeah, well, if I knew that, then I would be being paid lots of money by The Guardian, which is not the case, honestly. The Guardian, I think, is a really interesting organisation for this, because Alan Rusbridger, the editor, has, in a sense, pioneered thinking about what he calls mutual open journalism, and many of the Guardian journalists have pioneered really interesting ways of engaging with and sharing the journalism with their readers. And you know, they're different to economist readers. They're not as rich, but they certainly are as passionate about their newspaper brand as economist readers are, albeit in a different way. And of course the journalists are as well. Guardian journalists are you know, not there for the money, because the money isn't great, but because they also believe very strongly in the kind of ethos and purpose of their journalism. Now it's interesting when that comes together, because both sides, it's a bit, you know, like the metaphor of porcupines making love. It should be done carefully, you know, with great feeling, but carefully. And whilst there is huge enthusiasm, and the thing about the open weekend that we're talking about, this was 5,000 Guardian readers paid money to come and spend a weekend with at the Guardian buildings, and they did all sorts of things, from cookery classes to the seminars I was involved with, which were asking the audience, what can you know the Kennedy quote, do not ask what the Guardian can do for you, ask what can you do for the Guardian. And it extended to them saying, well, we'd like to leave you money in our will. But the most interesting bit was when they talked about how might you actually share in the journalism. And there's one moment when Alan Rusbridger, the editor, said, he was kind of musing aloud, I think, but he said, well, of course, we could get the readers to come in and help us moderate the websites. And you could sort of see some of the journalists wincing at that idea. And some of the readers, very enthusiastically saying, yes, when do we start? We'd love to get a hold of the comment fields. And I think that there's still, even in a very open and positive environment like The Guardian, there is a sort of cultural, it's very difficult for the journalists to surrender their power, if you like. And I don't mean they're power crazy, but their control, because they believe so much in what they're doing. And, you know, conversely, would you really trust a Guardian reader with your website? The answer, of course, yes, you would. But as I say, it's a sort of mutual exploring thing. But it has real results. And again, The Guardian is a very good example of where, if you're conscious of the Ian Tomlinson case, where a man was killed by police at a demonstration. It was only through the community of readers that they were able to get evidence of how that had happened. And I think Paul Lewis from The Guardian is going to come along later in this festival to talk about how he used social media partly to crowdsource with the readers when he was reporting on the riots last summer in England. So I think, you know, that there aren't specific rules. It's like I said before, that you have to work out what works. And also, this is very, very important, I'm sure Mark would agree with this, what are the transaction costs? You know, that there is, what is the point of spending hours and hours and hours desperately getting somebody to, one of your readers to contribute something? You know, if they don't want to do it, if it doesn't work for them, then you're wasting your time, and you should be paying much more attention to where they want to. And so in that sense, when the Guardian readers said, yes, we'd like to come and moderate, I honestly think that they should be thinking, well, yeah, why not? Do they have to be trained for 3 years, really? I'm not sure they do. So no rules, but lots of opportunities.
Thoughts, Mark Johnson?
Pardon?
Any thoughts?
On the opportunity cost of what? On the costs of running a community, or?
Yeah.
I think we should do everything possible to keep the cost of running a community down as low as possible, basically. I hear about the size of the moderation teams in some of the daily newspapers, and they are absolutely enormous, and they run day and night. And I just think there must be cleverer ways of doing it. A lot of our moderation is reported by our readers. Our readers report things that they find offensive or that they find abusive, and we have a moderation team who are actually out of house who take care of bringing most of that down. And so we've managed to keep quite a small team going, and I think that's quite important. And while this kind of stuff is still new, and while there are still people in the industry who need to be persuaded of why it matters, having a community that is, you know, weighed down with huge amounts of costs in terms of human staffing and human moderation is not great. So yes, and was that your question?
Well, here I've got another one too. My mind just keeps going with questions. This is a bit. Bear with me through this. What Charlie was just saying about the Guardian readers, about Russ Bridger saying, well, maybe the Guardian readers can moderate our comment fields, and the readers saying, my God, yes, that's a wonderful idea. 3 years ago, Nick Denton, the founder of Gawker Media, the blog network in the United States, implemented a scheme that was quite similar to that. He turned moderation of the comment sections in his various websites over to various trusted commenters who, if there was a star next to their name, they were given the power to promote certain comments from new and unregistered commenters, to hide comments that weren't up to snuff, and generally run the section as they saw fit. And Denton recently gave an interview where he said, well, that turned out to be a horrible way to run a comment section, and he's scrapping the entire scheme, because what it ended up as is the sections were dominated by a small number of people who had the time and effort to spend hours a day on the comment section of a website. And those people, Denton went on to say, were not necessarily the people whom you wanted to be commenting on a website. They weren't necessarily the ones who were most intelligent or informed or whatnot. And I think that goes along with what you said earlier about how small communities end up being led by individual voices, right? How they be dominated by the people who are most frequently around or most vocal in what they're saying. So I guess my question, if I do have one at all, rather than this just being a soliloquy, what's the middle ground between having a broad community of readers and commenters versus having a smaller one that is dominated by people who might be loud and might talk too much, but are nevertheless very sort of devoted to your magazine, your publication, what you will. How do you not alienate those people while simultaneously having them not necessarily dominate everything that goes on?
Well, I think this is a really interesting conversation, and I'll start with the gamification stuff that you were talking about. This whole gamification, can you translate that into Italian? Who knows? But this whole, it's a horrible word, gamification, but it's a really fashionable part of sort of community building at the moment. Everybody wants to find a way of putting a game in, something that motivates people to take part, something that gives them points or badges. And indeed, this is what Gorka did, and this is what Nick recently has been saying has not really worked for him. And I can see precisely why. Sort of systems that encourage repeat, Gorka's system actually required you at one point to audition to become a commenter. You had to leave 3 comments on the site or something like that before they decided that you were actually somebody who was going to leave sensible comments. And that wouldn't work for a site like The Economist, because we write about quite in-depth topics where to be a good commenter you need fairly specialized knowledge. And lots of those people read our site, and we want those people to leave comments. And the last thing we need is something that says, oh, you've got to prove to us that you're good, or your comment will only be shown if 7 or 8 people click the recommend button, because that's just going to turn them off straight away. So I think that our community would be healthier if it was 1 million people leaving 1 comment a month each than if it was 1,000 people leaving 1,000 comments a month each. And my concern about all this trend towards gamification is that it encourages lots of participation, but unless you do it absolutely right, it doesn't necessarily encourage the right kinds of things, and it turns off the kind of people who you need to participate. My problem is not getting a few people to participate a lot, it's getting a lot of people to participate a little bit. And the last thing I need is something more intimidating. Indeed, our biggest problem is that a lot of very smart people, indeed like all of you out there, are quite intimidated to comment on our website. I was at a barbecue last summer, and I met a young economist, a Catalan girl, who worked for the British government, and she'd read something in The Economist that week that absolutely incensed her, and it was about how Catalonia had banned bullfighting, I believe, and I think we'd made some comments about how it was more about setting them apart from the rest of Spain than it was about bullfighting. Anyway, she was furious about it, and we'd had a couple of drinks, which didn't help, but she pretty much picked up the magazine and flung it across the room at me, and I was delighted that she was so, engaged, and she was articulate about it, even with a couple of bottles of wine in her. And I said to her, why didn't you leave this comment on the website? You are the kind of person I dream about. And she said, well, it's The Economist, it feels sort of above us, and, lots of smart people there. And that is the problem that we need to deal with. And as much as I would like, and as much as the nerdy part of me would enjoy building a really complex system that, engages the right people, I just think that it would be a turn-off to the people that I really need to have a say on the website. So did that even answer your question? The other question you asked was about whether there's a middle ground between people commenting a lot and people commenting a little bit. I think that there is more. There's a natural tension in community building on a news site between the fact that most readers from a comment section who aren't participating want to read an article that provokes them and then read comments that also provoke them or that are interesting to them. They want to go straight to the most interesting one. On the other hand, as a sort of community person, you want to build a site where people who enjoy taking part can feel free to take part. They don't feel put off, that they want to talk to each other, that, if they want to have a debate about something which is interesting and relevant, but not exactly about the article that's there. I want them to be able to do that as well. So I think the answer is to have two strategies. One, to be very careful about the kind of things that you promote and allow to appear directly beneath your articles, so that readers just reading your article can go straight to the best comments. But also to have some other area of your site, some other place where readers who are just interested in those topics can come together and talk to each other about those things and have their questions answered. I think we serve a very important role if we can be a kind of site that puts together economist kind of people, that simply connects them with people that they would find interesting to talk to. And so I think a lot of the challenge of community on news sites is how do you balance those two things? And the way that people used to do it back in the day was that they would have comment threads, and they'd also have forums, that's where community started. And people have closed their forums because they didn't work. But I think there is a way to take debates that start under comment sections and then turn them into something else that lives somewhere else on your site. And we've not quite decided what that is yet, but I think there is an opportunity for us to do that, to be both a news site with sensible comments and a place where people who are interested in the topics we cover can start their own conversations. But if anybody has the answer, I'd love to know.
Yes, we'd all love to know, so raise your hand if you have that answer. Lucy, off of what Mark was saying and getting at, I think raises an interesting point about how some people might feel intimidated to comment on the Economist's website, or perhaps extrapolating a bit from what Mark said, that commentary or comments can often be dominated by one sort of person. And I'm sure that this is the sort of thing that you think about quite a bit at your work with the Open Knowledge Foundation, because I find it likely that the sort of people who participate in your projects are generally of similar educational background or of similar interests, whatnot. How do you expand that, right? How do you get people of a broader sort of expertise, range of experiences, whatnot, to start participating in projects of the sort that you do?
I think it's one of the biggest problems we face. We have, because we exist quite literally through mailing lists and through social media and everything, we find that a lot of the people who we end up interacting with kind of spend a lot of the time as lurkers, I think is the most accurate way to put it. And they sit there and they listen to the debates, and then I'll meet somebody at a conference and they'll say, oh yeah, I really, like, you send me loads of emails, like, this is, I really enjoy listening to the kind of debates that you have. And I think it is occasionally when somebody really bites, somebody who's just been lurking for a really long time, just finding the things that trigger them, but also acknowledging that they're there all of the time. So irrespective of whether they're actually participating in the debate, they're probably around. So we make at the OKF, we make a really conscious effort to respond to messages, even if so particularly the first time that somebody writes, because it's something that I found very strange when I first came to work for the OKF, that you would send a message essentially into oblivion. You have no idea, when you're on a mailing list, you have no idea who else is there, and that's been a barrier. Particularly, we've tried to encourage governments to kind of participate on them, and because they don't know who's there. A lot of the time, they find it very intimidating. They don't know who's watching them. They don't know if they're going to get into trouble for saying some of the things that they say. So, I mean, there are different things that we do, and in a couple of cases, we have made a very explicit effort to collect the names of the people who appear on the mailing list. And one of the conditions of being part of a particular list is that you know who the other people on it are. It's both reassuring and it's encouraging, and it encourages more kind of people of the same kind of interest group to participate, but it also gives that kind of reassurance. And it's not, I recognize that it's not possible to do this with every type of media. But if you are curating a type of, a mailing list type of thing, and you're looking for participation from somebody like a government, it may be a helpful way to go about it.
I'm going to throw this to questions in a minute, but off of what you just said, I think it is really important to have your readers or users or commenters or whatnot not feel like they're shouting into a void when they're trying to speak with or react to the people who are moderating or running whatever website or other thing that these people are using, because I think that's where a lot of the sort of anger that Charlie was talking about beforehand sort of comes from, the feeling that they're not being listened to, that their voices don't really matter. I do this thing at the Columbia Journalism Review where I work, where I'll just email random commenters, who say something on our website, if it's particularly inflammatory, or even if if they raise a good point about something, I'll grab their email address and I'll drop them a line, and it inevitably ends up helping. It inevitably ends up as the sort of thing that these people realize, gosh, I'm not just speaking to a faceless organization, that there are humans on the other side, and that there's grounds for sort of discussion and depolarization. And I think that's the sort of thing that is super important if you actually want your community to be a community and not just be a place where people are shouting at and past each other. Yeah, I could go on for hours, but I don't think anyone would want me to do that. So instead, let's throw it open to questions in the room. If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask or say to anyone on our panel, please raise your hand and someone will be around with a microphone. And to our panelists, we have earphones that will provide translations.
Hi, my name is Bente Kalsnes. I'm from Norway. And I have a question regarding the transaction costs. You mentioned some of the issues related to how journalists should deal with the comments. They should pay attention to them. Has that changed the way of how the journalist jobs has been defined? Do they have to pay more attention to the comment sections compared to actually writing stories? And another, on the positive side, has the writing changed because you get more feedback, more ideas, more contact information from readers? Are you making journalists based on the readers' comments?
Mark, why do you feel that?
Okay, I'll start. Two very good questions. So in terms of are journalists spending more time hanging around in comment sections and on the social web instead of writing? The truth is that I think they were doing it before. We didn't send out a memo that said, hey everybody, you must now leave 5 comments a month on the website. What we did is reverse a policy that said, previously, you cannot participate, do not do it, as many news organizations have, and turned that into a policy that said, you are very welcome to do it, here's a couple of general rules, but go for it. And the truth is that after you've spent, a lot of our journalists spend quite a long time writing their articles. We're lucky that because we're a weekly, that for a big piece you can spend a week, for a special report you can spend 3 or 4 months writing it. And I think once you put all that time into an article, you want to read the comments. And as I was saying, they were reading the comments anyway. They were finding it frustrating that people were misreading their stories, or they were telling them that they'd got things wrong that they hadn't and that they weren't able to respond. So no, it doesn't take up that much of their time. And generally they enjoy it, and they feel liberated by the fact that we're now encouraging them to take part when we never used to encourage them. And has it changed our journalism? I think not so much in our magazine, but certainly in what we do online. One of our big successes online was just to say to journalists, if you'd like to start a blog now, you are welcome to do it. We started about 20 blogs, and we did it without hugely staffing up. Almost all of our blogs are run by people who are also regular writers for our magazine, and they simply enjoy the fact that now they can write about the subjects that fascinate them more often than simply once a week. And so we do see the people that most enjoy their communities, they will write blog posts that are simply this morning I had an interesting thought about X or Y, and I'm wondering what you all think about it. We have some sort of quite niche blogs. We have one which is all about language, and they have an excellent community of language experts from around the world, and because we're so international, people who speak every language under the sun. And occasionally he will just ask questions. I have this theory, I've read this article about how language changes the way you speak, the way you think. What do you all think about it? And they will go on for pages and pages and pages. And also some of our journalists, some of our really best bloggers who are also print columnists, I think you can see them using their blogs as a way to sort of creep towards the article that they end up writing at the end of the week. One of our Badget columnists is excellent at this. He writes our Britain column every week. And often, if you read his blog posts for the 2 weeks before, you will see him sort of introduce an argument and see what people think about it. And then sort of, you'll see the next post develops it a bit further. And you'll read his column in the magazine 2 weeks later, and you'll see that it's been sort of informed by this process. And I think that's an excellent example of the power of communities to change the way that we think about journalism and to introduce new opportunities to produce different kinds of journalism. Sometimes quite lightweight stuff, like just simply writing a short post that says, "This is interesting, what do you think?"
In the back. Oh, I'm sorry, not in the back. Right in the front.
Salve, poco fa il signor Beckett ci ha chiesto quanti di noi commentano sul sito internet degli articoli che noi leggiamo e quanti invece dopo aver letto un articolo su Facebook. Io volevo chiedere cosa è per la testata più importante, lasciare un commento all'interno della pagina del sito internet o sul social network? Ad esempio, io sono molto più tradizionalista e quindi quando ad esempio io leggo soltanto il nome dell'articolo, non clicco neanche nel link che trovo su Facebook, ma vado direttamente nel sito del The Guardian o del Columbia Journalism Review e allora leggo l'articolo e lascio il commento direttamente all'interno del sito. Però poi vedo ad esempio che negli stessi articoli sul sito ci sono solo 4-5 commenti, mentre su Facebook, solo perché magari alcune persone hanno letto il titolo, ma non hanno letto effettivamente il contenuto dell'articolo, cominciano a commentare. Quindi alla fine qualitativamente cos'è meglio per il giornale e perché alla fine il giornalista dovrebbe andare a lavorare e dovrebbe in un certo senso espatriare in Facebook o in Twitter se poi alla fine il commento avviene soltanto dopo un'attenta lettura dell'articolo? Grazie.
Well, I think the simple answer is that the journalist would, or the news organization would, very much like it if you came to them and commented on their website or their Facebook page or their Twitter feed, because that way they're more likely to be able to monetize that conversation. If you have the conversation, elsewhere, then they're not going to make any money out of it, put simply. But of course, they also want, your attention, and they want it. And if there is a conversation happening somewhere else, then they hope that it's better to be talked about than ignored as a journalist. But I don't think there's necessarily an issue around quality. I think quality is a very tricky word in this context, in that it could be that, I think it's more about value than quality. I mean, there's a quality about, for example, if somebody on a comment gives the journalist a fantastic bit of information that they didn't have, well, obviously that's very useful. But the value might be that the comment is expressing a passionate opinion, a feeling even, an emotion. And of course, emotion is not always in the journalism. So if the emotion can come through the comment, well, that is valuable. That is a quality. And so I think you have to be careful. Now, you're sort of talking about, well, what's the most coherent? And I think what's interesting is how, in a way, traditional journalism isn't suited necessarily to creating a conversation, because you write a beautiful article, and then the first comment says, yeah, I know he's saying this, but what about something else? And the conversation goes, out the door to a different place that people want to take. And that can happen on the social networks, or it can happen on the newspaper. So I don't think it's a necessarily a question of either or. What's interesting is when you get different forms of journalism. So, for example, the live blog, which has built into it both. So where you have a live blog, and everyone does it now, the Times does it, the Guardian does it, the BBC does it. What you'll then get is you'll get comments beneath that live blog, but you'll also get the live blog connecting to people who are commenting on Twitter or Facebook or somewhere else, along with the other bits that they're bringing into that conversation. So in effect, the journalist is changing from being someone who writes and you respond to being somebody who is more of a facilitator, a chair, a connector of a conversation. And I think the quality can be anywhere in that.
I also think that quality isn't always necessarily immediately apparent, that, a long, well-articulated comment on a website, well, you can see the value in that. It's very well written. It's thought-provoking. But I think there can also be quality in someone just writing "this stinks" on a Facebook wall, because, well, perhaps you respond to that and say, "I'm sorry, you didn't like it," etc., and a conversation begins. And then the next time this person comments, maybe it's a little bit more involved, or maybe he stays on the level of telling you that you're terrible all the time, but at least this person might be more likely to keep reading the sorts of things that your organization produces, or otherwise stay sort of involved and engaged with the material that you're putting out. So I don't know if it's as easily divided between quality and garbage. I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Whoever has the microphone, please.
Hi, my name's Sorka. I'm from Ireland. I want to ask a quick question, going back to what Charlie was saying about quality, because one of the main debates about journalism through the 20th century was about the importance of objectivity. And as important as well as subjectivity is in opinionated journalism, I want to know, is objectivity dying? And does it have a face in the future of journalism? Facts and figures as opposed to just opinions. Thanks.
That's a great question. Anyone want to take that?
Sorka is a student at my university, and this question is purely a way of getting her research done for her dissertation essay. I think that the simple answer is that, yes, it has changed. It has changed the classic idea of objectivity, because, whatever that was in the first place. But that I think it's become, as soon as you become more participatory, as soon as the public's more involved, that you are constantly reminded that any judgment is provisional, and that as a journalist you have a privileged platform or power in the communication, but you are one of many voices, and that there are many experts and there are many different opinions out there, and that even about something as simple as an incident can be seen from many different perspectives. And so I think that it does. It reinforces, and some people don't like this. People like, even Jay Rosen, who talks about that you shouldn't just have he said, she said journalism. Well, in a sense, that's sort of what we do get with interactivity. We get one version, perhaps from an economist writer, and then there'll be 100 other versions and fragments and inputs from other people, and that is all part of the story that's being told.
And if you're interested in help with your term paper, I would recommend a special report that was written by my colleague Tom Standage on the future of news, and you'll be able to find online. And he wrote a lot about how news organizations, especially American ones, which have always been so strictly impartial, are becoming more partisan, and how that isn't necessarily a new thing or necessarily a bad thing for journalism. And our perspective in general on it at The Economist is that we've always tried to have very strong opinions about the things that we write about, that you are able to have an impartial reporting, stats, figures, analysis, and also at the end come to an opinion and a conclusion and a recommendation to your readers. And if you do the first bit but not the second bit, in many ways you're letting your readers down. You know, you've done the hard work to look into this, then why not tell the reader what conclusion that you've come to? And that has served us very well over the past, several decades. And I think more and more newspapers, as they try to focus on analysis rather than just on news, are also becoming a bit more willing to stand up for what they think.
Oh, one final question. Yes.
Hi. Many of you mentioned that most media, online media, encourage the journalists to participate, write, blog, perhaps. I was wondering, is there what kind of training, we can say, or indications from some media gives to its journalists? Is it a journalist completely, let's say, as a private citizen, can do what he likes, can have the tone he likes, or anyway there is an indication because he's not a private citizen, he's there because he works for that media? What is the story at The Economist, or perhaps if you know The Guardian?
Would you mind just repeating that? I'm not sure if I entirely heard correctly.
I meant what kind of indications does the media, the newsroom, or the community manager of a given media give to the journalists when they encourage the journalists to take an active part in conversation, moderating comments, etc.? Is the journalist completely free to write what he likes?
That's a really excellent question. And there's been a bit of a trend recently of people digging up each other's sort of social media guidelines and then sharing them online. And, lots of debate about who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. The truth is, at The Economist, we try to keep our rules as short and as lightweight as possible, because the big challenge is encouraging people to take part, explaining to them why it's exciting and important and why it's fun, and not giving them a long list of reasons why you could do something wrong and what the result of that would be. So our only guidelines for taking part in comment sections, for example, is about half a side of A4 that really just says, don't be stupid, and little more than that. And it's more about things that you should do rather than about things that you shouldn't. So we've tried to keep it lightweight, and that works for us at the moment because there aren't a lot of us, and maybe we'll have to issue firmer guidelines in future, but ours are as simple as possible and encourage participation rather than worry.
Lucy, what's your sort of general strategy for sort of participating in and stoking the discussions and such that arise in the communities that you coordinate?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I have wanted to say throughout this is that you can also benefit from being passive yourself. So you don't always have to stoke it. Like if you're a journalist, we've been asked on numerous occasions to provide mechanisms where journalists can basically just see where the hotspots are, just to show which parts people are most interested in. So I mean, I do a lot of outreach. We do calls and bring the right people together. So I have to spend quite a lot of energy making sure that the right people are involved in the debate, but also that's you don't have to pay attention to everything that's important. But.
Fair enough. We're going to one last question here from on the side.
Hi. About 2 months ago, BBC released a new social media policy, was telling that was forbidding the reporters to break news on Twitter before filing the updates to the news editor. So clearly BBC sees the social media as a competitor, and what's your opinion on that? And well, after what you said, you can say that you see the social media as your ally, but is there still an element of competition in that?
Well, I don't like to be too quick in sort of condemning what other news organisations have done, especially on social media. And I think with the BBC, there was some suggestion, well, as often happens when things break on social media, I think the BBC said that some aspect of what they'd written had been misquoted. And there was something similar with Sky as well. I don't know, we're all still learning, and I think we should, you know, every policy we put out, we will change it a year later, and that's the most important thing, to be able to say we were right or we were wrong, and if you were wrong, to change it. I also sort of believe that news organisations have a responsibility to kind of protect their brands. I don't think we're in that sort of halcyon world yet where the big names like The Economist and The Times and the BBC, those names don't matter anything or mean anything to readers. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing if news splits apart into lots of sort of celebrity journalists who you follow the journalist rather than the news organisation. I don't think that's good for news for now. And so I have no problem really with a news company saying breaking news should come through our feed. And, you know, at The Economist, of course, we all write without bylines, so we certainly believe that we gain something from swapping our own personal profiles for contributing to something which has a far bigger profile and a far bigger name than we would ever achieve on our own.
There we go. I want to end with a quick question for each person on this panel that hopefully you can answer in a few sentences or less. Charlie, in the article you wrote about the Guardian Open Weekend that I just read again before this panel began, at the bottom of that article there was a cartoon that contained a sentence that I found really interesting. I'm not sure whether this was your sentence or whether it was something that Russ Bridger or somebody else said, but it read, "We're on the cusp of something interesting in terms of news organizations and their relationships with their readers, their audiences, whatnot." So I'd like to put it to each panel member in turn. Looking 5 years or so down the road, what will that something interesting turn out to be? In the ideal sort of world, what does that look like? Where sort of are we ideally headed? And maybe this is too big a question to answer in a sentence or two, but do try.
Okay, I'll do it in one sentence. Well, the quote was from Alan Rusbridger, and the sentence before was, "The Guardian is losing £30 million a year. We have to change the way that we do our journalism, and public participation, open journalism is the way forward, and we're on the cusp of something new," which means, and the cusp means actually tipping into something quite different. And I think it is that the newspaper or the news organisation, certainly The Guardian, and this doesn't go for everyone, I think The Economist is in a different place, but that The Guardian will have to trust the idea of almost a total engagement with the public, not just as a pleasant way to make their journalism a bit more interesting, but actually as the core of their business as a whole.
Mark Johnson.
Yes, it's a big question, so I'll try not to give too simple an answer, but I think, you know, big news organisations are going to get smaller. There's always going to be a place, I think, for people that provide trusted analysis, as there's so much more information out there. The need for somebody to filter, the need for somebody to say this is what matters and this is why is going to get ever greater. But organisations that specialise just in telling you what happened today are going to find it ever harder. I think a lot of their journalists will splinter off into smaller verticals. I think we'll see a lot more little blogs, a lot more sort of smaller cooperative sites started by 2 or 3 or 4 journalists who used to work for big papers. And I think we'll see that all of those new startups will put community at the very heart of what they do, because that is how you go from being a tiny, niche, brand new startup to being something that's much bigger, especially if you don't have a lot of staff or a lot of money.
And I guess from my side, I kind of hope that the change isn't with the news organisations so much as with the readership. I think online participation is a relatively new thing, which has been, I think there's a phrase, forum terror or something, where people are still quite terrified of putting their thoughts as an individual online with their face next to it. And I hope both in kind of participation more widely beyond journalism, kind of government participation, if we're going to get people to actually engage in real debates that make changes, that people lose that intimidation, and hopefully that's just something that will come from people like you guys encouraging people to take part. So hopefully that's where the change will.
So in conclusion, the solution is us 4 people. Works for me. I want to thank my panelists here. From the right, Lucy Chambers from the Open Knowledge Foundation. Lucy, you're speaking quite a bit this week. Where can people see you next?
Our next session is we're mainly doing workshops, but it's the scraping. We're teaching people how to screen scrape, so that if you can't get hold of your data by conventional means and people won't give it to you, we can still teach you how to get it off the web. And that is this afternoon. I'm just looking for the exact time, but there are a series of about 7 more data journalism workshops.
That's right, Lucy wins the medal. She's speaking 9 separate times over this conference. So applause for her. Mark Johnson of The Economist, you're also speaking again, aren't you?
Yes, if you enjoyed that, or if you just want to come back and heckle me, I'm on Saturday. I'm talking about whatever happened to weeklies, so how The Economist has moved to digital, and there's smart people from Die Zeit and from Condé Nast and from Mother Jones as well, so I'm really looking forward to that, so I hope you'll come.
And Charlie Beckett from the London School of Economics. Charlie, where are you speaking next this week?
Tonight we're doing Coney 2012, but at 3:30 we have David Aranovich from Rupert Murdoch's Times newspaper, and Amelia Hill from The Guardian phone hacking team to talk about phone hacking, British journalism. Is it now as bad as Italian journalism?
And your book on WikiLeaks is on sale at the Festival Bookstore, correct?
I've no idea if it is, but it's definitely available on Amazon, yes.
And if it's not at the Festival Bookstore, just go in there and scream and throw things until they find some copies. Yes, I'm Justin Peters from the Columbia Journalism Review. Please join me tomorrow afternoon where we'll be sort of advancing on the ideas that we discussed in this panel to talk about how communities and news organizations, we can move from beyond comments and discussions toward actual collaboration in the news gathering and reporting process. Until then, thank you so much for coming and staying, and please enjoy the rest of your day.